Hey guys, this is Mike with 4 and 6 Music. So what I want to do in today's video is I actually want to go through some different jazz albums that have influenced me as a player and as a music lover. So I think what's really important about being a musician is first and foremost being a music lover, because at the end of the day what you're doing a lot of times is you're copying what you're listening to and trying to take what you're copying and make it your own. So especially for a musician, one of the goals as a musician is to get your own sound and to find your own voice. And I think in doing that, you have to really listen to a lot of different types of music and choose what works for you, what you jive with, and maybe reject some of the other stuff that doesn't really fit into your style. But I think being aware of other genres of music and other types of music, even if you're not a fan of it, is super important, especially when you're a musician, because a lot of times you're going to be asked to play music that you don't particularly like, that you're not really into. And I mean, yeah, that's just the life of being a musician. So anyway, jazz was actually a genre of music that when I was in high school, I was really unaware of. I wasn't really too sure where to start. And so I asked my guitar teacher, what album should I start with? And the album that he told me to start with, and this is the first jazz album I really heard, was Miles Davis' Kind of Blue. So for those of you who don't know, Miles Davis was a jazz trumpet player, and what he was very famous for wasn't really so much his playing, because he wasn't a virtuoso like Charlie Parker, who he played with earlier in his career. He was actually very famous for being a visionary within the jazz genre. And he started a lot of different subgenres within jazz, or at least really helped to perpetuate them into the audience. So one type was cool jazz, and the next type, which we see in Kind of Blue, is modal jazz. So modal jazz, I'll do a video on that, is basically when they simplify the chord progressions that's happening over the underneath the melody. So a lot of times you have chord changes, which we talked about in other videos, such as the infamous 2-5-1, which is littered all over jazz. But modal jazz just takes all that out of the equation and just uses one chord pretty much. And so the possibilities, especially for an improviser, are endless. And what Kind of Blue does is, when Miles decided to record this album, I mean, he had the lineup on this album is just the who's who of jazz musicians at the time. So you had Paul Chambers on the bass, who played with Coltrane and so many different other musicians. You have Coltrane himself on here. You have Bill Evans on the piano, Wynton Kelly on the piano. So both of them play on select songs within the album. You have Julian Cannonball Adderley, who we talked about in another video when we talked about the diminished exercise that I created based off of this improvised diminished lick that Cannonball Adderley used. And we have Jimmy Cobb, the great drummer. So, like I said, this is the who's who of jazz play on this album. And what makes the album really special is that, unlike other jazz albums where there would be a lot of rehearsal and shows being played before the album was recorded in order to get comfortable with the material, Miles and Bill Evans composed a lot of these songs, and when the other musicians came in for the session, they saw these songs for the very first time. They never saw these songs previously, never played the songs. So what you're getting on the album is quintessentially what jazz is about, which is improvisation. And first thought is best thought. And that was something that Miles utilized in his playing and in his outlook as not only a musician, but a band leader. Um, anyway, so I listened to Kind of Blue when I was in high school. I bought the album blindly, like I would with a lot of albums back in the day, because I didn't have YouTube at my disposal or anything like that. And quite honestly, I was underwhelmed with that album. I really didn't like it all that much. I thought it was slow, boring, and it wasn't really until years later when I started listening to the album again that I really started to appreciate it. And enjoy it quite a bit. It is a fantastic record, and it's a classic. But as far as Miles goes, my go-to album for Miles, and it's the same, pretty much the same group of musicians, would be Milestones. And on this album is where we get the first taste of modal jazz with the song Milestones. So this album is just fantastic, and like I said, it pretty much has the same group of musicians that Miles plays with on Kind of Blue. This is the album, I believe this is the album that precedes Kind of Blue. I don't think there's another album before Kind of Blue. But yeah, well, I know there are other albums, but this is the album right before Kind of Blue. Anyway, so this is the album I usually listen to, and this is my go-to Miles record. Yeah, the stuff that he did with his second group, with Wayne Shorter, and all those guys. I mean, that stuff is fantastic as well. But for me, like I said, Milestones is generally my go-to. But the album that really opened me up to jazz and kind of started me on this journey was John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. So this album is very special. I was actually in a jazz improv class when I was in high school, and my teacher decided to bring in this album, and we listened to the second and the third track. There are 4 total on the album, and I've never heard jazz that was that energetic, that was that... It was almost like Coltrane and the group, his quartet, were harnessing this energy that could explode at any moment, but it was always within their grasp. They had control over it, but not really. Sometimes you would think it would dismantle at any moment, but it just never did, and it just came together so perfectly, even though there are things happening on there where you're just like, wow, how do you explain that, especially theoretically? Because when I was younger, I would always try to figure out things from a theoretical point of view when, as far as music goes, once I started learning theory and all of that. But, you know, as I get older, I use theory, I love theory, I do veer a little bit away towards... away from theory only because you can get so bogged down by theory, and it can sort of be a hamper as far as your creativity goes. So I really don't like to harp on the theory too much. Yeah, it's important, and I do use it in my lessons as far as explaining certain things, and it can be really beneficial. But at the end of the day, if it sounds good, it sounds good. And for me, that's what A Love Supreme was. It was just great sounding music. And after that class, when I got home that day, I actually went straight to the FYE. That's a pretty well, it was a like a pretty big music store, and so I walked there because there was one close to my house, and I picked up "Was Love Supreme" and listened to it several times when I got back home that day. So I mean, like I said, this was just an album that was my gateway into jazz. And along the way, I found some albums and some musicians who really inspired me, not as only as a player, but as a person to explore the musical possibilities. And before I get to another artist, this album, so this is a live album from John Coltrane, live at Newport. And the CD version's really nice because they have a live version of Impressions, which is just some of the most exciting music you could listen to. So what's interesting about this, though, is the 1963 Newport performance didn't have Elvin Jones, the drummer, on it. It actually had Roy Haynes, yeah. So Roy Haynes was the drummer on that 1963 date, and so when you listen to it, it's got a bit of a different feel because Elvin Jones was the drummer that Coltrane played with for a lot of his career, especially for his Impulse label stuff. That is until he got, you know, into the more free jazz stuff, and Elvin was just not really digging the direction that Coltrane was taking musically. But that album, live at Newport, hearing it the Coltrane Quartet with this other drummer, Roy Haynes, was it kind of breathes like some fresh air into the group. And like I said, for the song Impressions, I mean, there's just so much energy in that song, and it's just wild stuff, man. So yeah, my suggestion, if you're getting into jazz, don't just focus on the studio records. Explore a lot of the live albums as well. You can look, find official releases like this or bootleg performances, which I know some people aren't a big fan of bootlegs because they feel it rips the artist off. I totally get that. I own bootlegs. For me, if it's that important of an album or that important of a performance, the record label will put it out. And if they don't, the fans want to hear the music, so that's why we have bootlegs. Anyway, like I said, check out live stuff when it comes to jazz, not just the studio albums. And when it comes to Coltrane, I really can't think of, for me personally, a more exhilarating live album of his than his Newport performance, specifically the 1963 performance. So, another musician within jazz that I really had quite an affinity for, that I listened to and thought, like, no one else sounds like this, was Charles Mingus. A lot of people would talk about his Mingus album. That's usually like one of his top albums that a lot of fans will cite as like a top 10 jazz album. And I love that album. That was actually the first album I picked up from Mingus. But this album, The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, is a masterpiece. This album is, there's nothing else like it. There's no other music that I found that even comes close to achieving what Mingus achieves on that recording. I mean, to the point that he never even performed the material on this album live as a whole, because, just like with The Love Supreme, Black Saint and the Sinner Lady is divided up into 4 sections, and the instrumentation for this album is just wild. He's using like a flamenco style guitar. Well, he's not playing it, but he does have a flamenco guitarist play some passages within jazz. And so you hear this and you're just like, whoa, like, what do you even call this? So yeah, that was, like I said, a very exciting album. When I first heard that, I never heard anything like that within jazz or outside of the genre. It's just completely in its own league. And Mingus, I think, as an individual, was just in his own league. He definitely ruffled feathers and got under a lot of people's skin, and was very uncompromising as a band leader and as an individual. But I think those are always the most exciting people for me personally. Even if I disagree with them, or if I think that they're probably a little bit out of line with their behavior, because Mingus was. I mean, he famously knocked out Jimmy Knepper, this trombone player. He knocked him out, and basically right in the face, ended up ruining his career, because he was a trombonist, and for horn players, the embouchure, your mouth, is super important when it comes to playing the instrument. And this guy's career was essentially ruined because of Mingus. And so, that sort of behavior I would not agree with, nor would I, do something like that. But still, for me personally, Mingus is somebody that I look up to as a musician, as a composer, as a visionary. Not to say that I am a visionary, but if I were to look up to visionaries, Mingus would be top of the list. And for Jimmy Knepper, the trombonist who basically got knocked out by Mingus, he still worked with Mingus even after he got clogged by him. And there's a reason for that. It's just because Mingus was a genius, and he did things that nobody else did. So yeah, I would definitely say check that out. Black Saint and the Sinner Lady is a masterpiece. You will not be disappointed by that album. And if you are, listen to it again, because you're missing something. All right, so another album that I really, really dig. And usually when it comes to this group, a lot of people talk about Moaning, the album that is played with a different group, a different set of musicians. It's still pretty much the same group though, and that is the Jazz Messengers. So this is before it became Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. This is when Horace Silver was in the band, the piano player right over here. And this is their debut album, The Jazz Messengers. This is just a fantastic, fantastic record. And when it comes to jazz, for me personally, this is the sort of stuff that I really like to listen to, is that hard bop, very soulful sounding jazz, very bluesy sounding, and that's what you get on a Jazz Messengers record, especially the debut album, like I said. So, yeah, when it comes to different groups, you know, jazz doesn't really have bands like other genres of music have, where you can follow along with a band. You're usually following along with the musician, and a lot of times they're going to be recording albums with other musicians. So, you know, for example, Art Blakey played with a lot of different musicians, one of which was a very famous guitarist called Grant Green, who I was actually talking about with a coworker of mine the other day. But Art Blakey, he was such a great drummer that he would be on a session musician for a lot of other jazz musicians who wanted to have him on their record. But he had his own group, and that's not something you usually see in jazz. You do see it with Miles, with both of his quintets, the first one with Coltrane, and then the second one with Wayne Shorter. And you do have that every now and then, like I said before when we talked about Love Supreme, that was with Coltrane's famous quartet. So yeah, you do have certain groups that are within the genre, but that's not usually the case. Usually you're following a musician that you really latch onto. But with the Jazz Messengers, that was a group. And even though the musicians changed over time, they still had Art Blakey at the center of it, who would constantly rotate these musicians in. So once, let's say, they played for a number of years, he would rotate to younger musicians because he thought that the younger musicians had a fire and a vision that older musicians lacked. And so that's, I think, part of the reason why listening to a Jazz Messengers record is super exciting, is because you have the wisdom that Art Blakey brings to the group, along with the fire that the younger players bring to the group. So yeah, that generally makes for really exciting recordings, and especially some of their live stuff is fantastic. Live at Birdland is a great record by them. But like I said, their debut album, that is usually my go-to. I love Moaning, the album with Bobby Timmons, who wrote the song. But usually if I'm going to put on a Jazz Messengers record, it's either going to be one of their live records or their debut album. Moving right along, we're going to talk about Jazz Samba. So Jazz Samba is a different subgenre within jazz. This is more in the samba bossa nova style of jazz, which originated in Brazil with Antonio Carlos Jobim, a very famous composer from Brazil, and a composer who really started to propel this subgenre into other countries such as the U.S. So Stan Getz and Charlie Bird, both American musicians, play within that style, and they created this album that they recorded in, I think, one day in a church. And this album is just memorable. I mean, there's half the solos, if not all the solos. Yeah, I'd say all the solos on this. They're solos that you could hum, that you could remember, and I think that's something that's really an aspect of jazz that is lacking, because a lot of times there's that idea of showing off and woodshedding and practicing on stage, and as much as I love a musician like Coltrane's probably one of my favorite musicians of all time. You know, something that he would do is just experiment on stage, which is exciting to watch. But when it comes to records and when it comes to recordings, a lot of times it could be overwhelming as to the listener. And that's when an album like this is a great album to put on, because this album has solos, improvised solos, but they are so melodic that it is infectious. It is easy to get parts of these solos, if not the whole things, stuck in your head. And that's not even mentioning the melodies in these songs, right? So this would be a great album, especially if you're more so on the song side of things rather than you know, wanting to listen to long-winded solos, because I know that's not really for everybody. And you know, for me, I'm more so a song person first before the talent. You know, even though this is all jazz and everything, I mean, you know, for me, I feel at home when I listen to a song and that song is a memorable one that gets stuck in your head. Because, you know, at the end of the day, you listen to music for enjoyment, and I enjoy songs. So a lot of times when it comes to jazz, especially when it comes to the new stuff, I mean, most of the jazz I listen to is from the 50s and 60s. I'll listen to some earlier stuff as well. I don't mind listening to some big band music. You know, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, all those guys are great. And they wrote timeless music. But when it comes to a lot of the jazz music I hear now, most of the time it's just, it's not memorable. It doesn't really, it's not about the song, it's more so about the player. And there will be players who I really enjoy watching play live music, and then I'll listen to one of their records and I just feel so underwhelmed because the songs are not there. But with this album, the songs are there. And, you know, like I said, this is a lot more straightforward than something like Black Saint and the Sinner Lady by Charles Mingus. This is just, this is all about the songs, and the songs aren't too long as well. And the record itself is not that long as well. We only have like, seven songs, and the longest song is about 6.5 minutes. You know, with some jazz songs, they go on for like 10 minutes. I mean, Coltrane, if you listen to some of his live stuff, he goes on for, you know, 20 plus minutes. You know, he's famous for sometimes going for an hour on one song. So, you know, that could be a little bit too much, I understand. But, you know, this is where it's at as far as the songs, because that's really what's important when it comes to listening to music, at least, you know, for me anyway. And moving right along, we are going to end this with Wes Montgomery. So with Wes, his studio stuff is really awesome, but for me, his live stuff is the best. That's where I think Wes shines as a musician, and that's when you hear some of his most exciting soloing. Because a lot of times, especially when he was playing in a recording where there were other musicians, he would sometimes get intimidated, not so much in the quartet setting, but if there were more musicians than that, if there were like strings added, there was a big band, his playing would be a little bit more restrained than it would be when it was a live recording. And not to say that his studio recordings are, you know, something to scoff at. On the contrary, some of those are, I think, some of the most exciting jazz guitar solos, and just some of the most exciting music that you could possibly listen to within the jazz genre. But his live stuff is another level from that. So this album is usually like the go-to when it comes to Wes Montgomery smoking at the half note. And this album has, like I said, some really exciting guitar solos and exciting playing, not just from Wes, but also from Wynton Kelly, the piano player who played with Wes on the date. And if you look at this, and this is something that is really pivotal to jazz, is the liner notes. So when it comes to a record, a jazz record, you have, of course, the track listing, the personnel who was playing on the record, because a lot of times, again, like I mentioned, it wasn't so much groups that was within the jazz scene, but more so it was individual musicians who would play with other musicians, right? So yeah, you'd always be curious, like, oh, who's that's playing? And I've done that before, where I listened to someone like Mingus. He played some live dates with musicians like Eric Dolphy and Jackie Biard, and I remember listening to Farewell Eric, I think that was the tune. It's like a bluesy number, and there's a live recording with a killer solo by Jackie Biard on the piano. And when I heard that, I was like, man, what a awesome player. That is somebody I would like to listen to more of. And so I checked out some of his stuff, because when it comes to jazz, a lot of times you don't know where to start. But once you get started, it's very easy to continue along the genre, because you'll find albums you really like. Then you'll look for certain musicians who played on those albums, and you'll see what albums they put out, maybe as leaders under their own name, or maybe as sidemen for other jazz musicians. Anyway, so this is with Wynton Kelly. And over here on the right side, my left, on this side you have liner notes. So this is pretty much information about the record, about the artist, about the other musicians who played on the album. And it was usually written by a jazz critic. Usually. Black Saint and the Sinner Lady by Mingus, his liner notes was written, first half of his liner notes were written by Mingus himself, in which he criticized music critics, which is awesome. And then the other section was written by his psychologist. So, it doesn't always have to be a music critic who writes the liner notes, but, most of the time it's going to be. It's just that musicians like Mingus, they march to the beat of their own drum. So, yeah, that's one thing when it comes to jazz records that you'll see is the liner notes. And, when you're into the music and you want to learn more about it, that's what you would read. Because especially at that time, during the 50s and the 60s, internet was not around. So how did you find out more about the musicians? You'd have to read about them. And yeah, you could pick up magazines, even like Playboy magazine, which, is known for the pornography. It's known for that aspect of it. But there were actually a lot of great interviews with jazz musicians from Playboy. So you could find interviews with people like Miles Davis in Playboy magazine, which is pretty wild because, like I said, they're more so known for the pornographic aspect, not the interviews that they would do with jazz musicians and all that. But, that was a thing in Playboy. So if you wanted to learn more about them, yeah, you'd have to read magazines, but also you could read the liner notes. And like I said, you'd get some more information about the artists, maybe some previous albums that they were on, some of the guest musicians they'd have, or the session musicians, and then you'd find their name and explore from there. Like, oh, what else did they play on? So if you're not sure where to start with jazz, I would say start with some of those albums, check them out. You might like them, you may not. Everyone has their own taste. I get that, but it's a good place to start. With some of those albums, and pick an album that you really like if it really speaks to you, and look at the personnel, look who's on those records, and see what else they played on. And I can promise you that once you get started, you'll go down the rabbit hole and discover things and music that you never thought you would discover. So anyway, I hope that was informative, useful for you guys. Like I said, today wasn't really so much about teaching you something on the guitar or the bass, but more so about just expanding your musical horizon, which is super important as a musician, and it's something that I don't think there's enough focus on that when it comes to music education. I think a lot of times it's more so about the skills, the technical skills that are achievable on the instrument, but how else are you going to use those technical skills if you don't know how to use them, or like what else has been done on the instrument that you're playing or on other instruments. What other ideas have been floating around? Because when it comes to exercises like the diminished exercise that I shared with you guys, that idea was within the musical community for many years, even before jazz. So it's constantly about discovering what was happening beforehand and then using that within your own playing and then possibly creating something new from what was old, right? And with that, we'll end the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will see you guys in the next video. Next one should be more so a lesson, but I will be doing these every now and then where I talk about albums that have been influential for me and albums that I think would benefit you guys as musicians and music fans. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.